Tonight I will be reading several chapters from the book Little House on the Prairie. This story is about a little girl named Laura Ingalls and her family who leave behind their little house in the big woods of Wisconsin and are now heading to Kansas. The story captures the essence of pioneer life through the eyes of a young Laura. She provides vivid descriptions of the challenges and joys of frontier living, with detailed accounts of hunting trips, encounters with Native Americans, and the hardships they face as early settlers. This book has captured the hearts of both young and old, making it a cherished classic. And so, as always, my friend, take a nice deep breath and let it out slowly. Feel all the tension in your body just melt away. You're all cozy and safe in your bed. So it's time to relax and let go now. Start by softening your forehead and smoothing out your brow. Relax your eyes and unclench your jaw. Let your whole face be smooth and relaxed. Now imagine your shoulders dropping down and easing back, and just let them go. And feel the relaxation and heaviness flow down through your arms, down through your hands, and all the way into your fingers. Let them be loose and limp. Feel your chest and belly become soft. Let your back melt down into your bed. And allow that relaxation to flow down into your hips, into your legs, into your feet, and all the way down into your toes. Every muscle in your legs feel heavy, loose, and limp. And as our story begins, your body and mind will keep on relaxing. Just listen to my words and allow your imagination to take you away. And everything will begin to slow down. Even your breathing and thoughts will slow down as you listen. It's all preparing you for a peaceful sleep. My friend, there's nothing else you need to do right now, and nowhere else you need to be. So just lay back, relax, and enjoy the story. Chapter 9: A Fire on the Hearth. Outside the house, close to the log wall opposite the door, Pa cut away the grass and scraped the ground smooth. He was getting ready to build the fireplace. Then he and Ma put the wagon box on the wheels again, and Pa hitched up Pet and Patty. The rising sun was shortening all the shadows. Hundreds of meadow larks were rising from the prairie, singing higher and higher in the air. Their songs came down from the great clear sky like a rain of music, and all over the land, where the grasses waved and murmured under the wind, thousands of little dicky birds clung with their tiny claws to the blossoming weeds and sang their thousands of little songs. Pat and Patty sniffed the wind and whinnied with joy. They arched their necks and pawed at the ground because they were eager to go. Pa was whistling while he climbed to the wagon seat and took up the reins. Then he looked down at Laura, who was looking up at him, and he stopped whistling and said, "Want to go along, Laura? You and Mary?" Ma said they could. They climbed up the wheels, clinging to the spokes with their bare toes, and they sat on the high wagon seat beside Pa. Pat and Patty started with a little jump, and the wagon went jolting down the road that Pa's wagon wheels had made. They went down between the bare, reddish-yellow walls of earth, all ridged and wrinkled by forgotten rains. Then they went on across the rolling land of the creek bottoms. Masses of trees covered some of the low, rounded hills, and some of them were grassy, open spaces. Deer were lying in the shadows of the trees, and deer were grazing in the sunshine on the green grass. They lifted their heads and pricked their ears, and stood chewing and watching the wagon with their soft, large eyes. All along the road, the wild larkspur was blossoming pink and blue and white. Birds balanced on yellow plumes of goldenrod, and butterflies were fluttering. Starry daisies lighted the shadows under trees. Squirrels chattered on branches overhead. White-tailed rabbits hopped along the road, and snakes wriggled quickly across when they heard the wagon coming. Deep in the lowest valley the creek was running, in the shadow of dirt bluffs. When Laura looked up those bluffs, she couldn't see the prairie grass at all. Trees grew up the bluffs where the earth had crumbled, and where the bare dirt was so steep that trees couldn't grow on it, bushes held on desperately with their roots. Half-naked roots were high above Laura's head. "Where are the Indian camps?" Laura asked Pa. He had seen the Indians' deserted camps here among the bluffs, but he was too busy to show them to her now. He must get the rocks to build the fireplace. "You girls can play," he said, "but don't go out of my sight, and don't go into the water, and don't play with snakes. Some of the snakes down here are poison." So Laura and Mary played by the creek, while Pa dug the rocks he wanted and loaded them into the wagon. They watched long-legged water bugs skate over the glassy, still pools. They ran along the bank to scare the frogs, and laughed when the green-coated frogs with their white vests plopped into the water. They listened to the wood pigeons call among the trees, and the brown thrush singing. They saw the little minnows swimming all together in the shallow places where the creek ran sparkling. The minnows were thin gray shadows in the rippling water. Only now and again one minnow flashed the sunshine from its silvery belly. There was no wind along the creek. The air was still and drowsy warm. It smelled of damp roots and mud, and it was full of the sound of rustling leaves and of the water running. In muddy places, where deer's tracks were thick and every hoof print held water, swarms of mosquitoes rose up with a keen, sharp buzzing. Laura and Mary slapped at mosquitoes on their faces and necks and hands and legs, and wished they could go wading. They were so hot, and the water looked so cool. Laura was sure it would do no harm just to dip one foot in, and when Pa's back was turned, she almost did. "Laura," said Pa, and she snatched the naughty foot back. "If you girls want to go wading," Pa said, "you can do it in that shallow place. Don't go in over your ankles." Mary waded only a little while. She said the gravel hurt her feet, and she sat on a log and patiently slapped at mosquitoes. But Laura slapped and kept on waiting. When she stepped, the gravel hurt her feet. When she stood still, the tiny minnows swarmed about her toes and nibbled them with their tiny mouths. It was a funny, squiggling feeling. Laura tried and tried to catch a minnow, but she only got the hem of her dress wet. Then the wagon was loaded. Pa called, "Come along, girls," and they climbed to the wagon seat again and rode away from the creek. Up through the woods and hills they rode again, to the high prairie where the winds were always blowing and the grasses seemed to sing and whisper and laugh. They had had a wonderful time in the creek bottoms, but Laura liked the high prairie best. The prairie was so wide and sweet and clean. That afternoon, Ma sat sewing in the shade of the house, and baby Carrie played on the quilt beside her, while Laura and Mary watched Pa build the fireplace. First he mixed clay and water to a beautiful thick mud in the Mustang's water bucket. He let Laura stir the mud while he laid a row of rocks around 3 sides of the space he had cleared by the house wall. Then, with a wooden paddle, he spread the mud over the rocks. In the mud, he lay another row of rocks and plastered them over the top and down on the inside with more mud. He made a box on the ground. 3 sides of the box were made of rocks and mud, and the other side was the log wall of the house. With rocks and mud and more rocks and more mud, he built the walls as high as Laura's chin. Then on the walls, close against the house, he laid a log. He plastered the log all over with mud. After that, he built up rocks and mud on top of that log. He was making the chimney now, and he made it smaller and smaller. He had to go to the creek for more rocks. Laura and Mary could not go again because Ma said the damp air might give them a fever. Mary sat beside Ma and sewed another block of her 9-patch quilt, but Laura mixed another bucketful of mud. Next day, Pa built the chimney as high as the house wall. Then he stood and looked at it. He ran his fingers through his hair. "You look like a wild man, Charles," Ma said. "You're standing your hair all on end." "It stands on end anyway, Caroline," Pa answered. "When I was courting you, it never would lie down, no matter how much I slicked it with bear grease." He threw himself down on the grass at her feet. "I'm plumb tuckered out, lifting rocks up there." "You've done well to build the chimney up so high all by yourself," Ma said. She ran her hand through his hair and stood it up more than ever. "Why don't you make it stick and daub the rest of the way?" she asked him. "Well, it would be easier," he admitted. "I'm blamed if I don't believe I will." He jumped up. Ma said, "Oh, stay here in the shade and rest a while." But he shook his head. "No use lazing here while there's work to be done, Caroline. The sooner I get the fireplace done, the sooner you can do your cooking inside out of the wind." He hauled saplings from the woods, and he cut and notched them and laid them up like the walls of the house on top of the stone chimney. As he laid them, he plastered them well with mud, and that finished the chimney. Then he went into the house, and with his axe and saw, he cut a hole in the wall. He cut away the logs that had made the 4th wall at the bottom of the chimney, and there was the fireplace. It was large enough for Laura and Mary and baby Carrie to sit in. Its bottom was the ground that Pa had cleared of grass, and its front was the space where Pa had cut away the logs. Across the top of that space was the log that Pa had plastered all over with mud. On each side, Pa pegged a thick slab of green oak against the cut ends of the log. Then, by the upper corners of the fireplace, he pegged chunks of oak to the wall, and on these He laid an oak slab and pegged it firmly. That was the mantel shelf. As soon as it was done, Ma sat in the middle of the mantel shelf, the little China woman she had brought from the big woods. The little China woman had come all the way and had not been broken. She stood on the mantel shelf with her little China shoes and her wide China skirts and her tight China bodice and her pink cheeks and blue eyes and golden hair, all made of china. Then Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura stood and admired that fireplace. Only Carrie did not care about it. She pointed at the little China woman and yelled when Mary and Laura told her that no one but Ma could touch it. "You'll have to be careful with your fire, Caroline," Pa said. "We don't want sparks going up the chimney to set the roof on fire. That cloth would burn easy. I'll split out some clapboards as soon as I can and make a roof you won't have to worry about." So Ma carefully built a little fire in the new fireplace, and she roasted a prairie hen for supper, and that evening they ate in the house. They sat at a table by the western window. Pa had quickly made the table of 2 slabs of oak. One end of the slabs stuck in a crack of the wall, and the other end rested on short, upright logs. Pa had smoothed the slabs with his axe, and the table was very nice when Ma spread a cloth over it. The chairs were chunks of big logs. The floor was the earth that Ma had swept clean with her broom. On the floor, in the corners, the beds were neat under their patchwork quilts. The rays of the setting sun came through the window and filled the house with golden light. Outside, and far, far away to the pink edge of the sky, the wind went blowing and the wild grasses waved. Inside, the house was pleasant. The good roast chicken was juicy in Laura's mouth. Her hands and face were washed, her hair was combed, her napkin was tied around her neck. She sat up straight on the round end of log and used her knife and fork nicely as Ma had taught her. She did not say anything, because children must not speak at table until they are spoken to. But she looked at Pa and Ma and Mary and at baby Carrie in Ma's lap, and she felt contented. It was nice to be living in a house again. Chapter 10. A Roof and a Floor. All day long, every day, Laura and Mary were busy. When the dishes were washed and the beds made, there was always plenty to do and to see and to listen to. They hunted for birds' nests in the tall grass, and when they found them, the mother birds squawked and scolded. Sometimes they touched a nest gently, and all in an instant, a nest full of downiness became a nest full of wide gaping beaks hungrily squawking. Then the mother bird scolded like anything, and Mary and Laura quietly went away because they did not want to worry her too much. In the tall grass, they lay still as mice and watched flocks of little prairie chickens running and pecking around their anxiously clucking, smooth brown mothers. They watched striped snakes rippling between the grass stems or lying so still that only their tiny flickering tongues and glittering eyes showed that they were alive. They were garter snakes and would not hurt anybody, but Laura and Mary did not touch them. Mary said snakes were best left alone because some snakes would bite, and it was better to be safe than sorry. And sometimes there'd be a great gray rabbit, so still in the lights and shadows of a grass clump that you were near enough to touch him before you saw him. Then, if you were very quiet, you might stand a long time looking at him. His round eyes stared at yours without meaning anything. His nose wiggled, and sunlight was rosy through his long ears, that had delicate veins in them and the softest short fur on their outsides. The rest of his fur was so thick and soft that at last you couldn't help trying very carefully to touch it. Then he was gone in a flash, and the place where he had been sitting was hollowed and smooth and still warm from his warm behind. All the time, of course, Laura or Mary was minding baby Carrie, except when she had her afternoon nap. Then they sat and soaked in the sunshine and the wind until Laura forgot that the baby was sleeping. She jumped up and ran and shouted till Ma came to the door and said, "Dear me, Laura, must you yell like an Indian?" "I declare," Ma said, "if you girls aren't getting to look like Indians, can I never teach you to keep your sunbonnets on?" Pa was up on the house wall beginning the roof. He looked down at them and laughed. "One little Indian, 2 little Indians, 3 little Indians," he sang softly. "No, only 2. "You make 3, Mary said to him. "You're brown too." "But you aren't little, Pa," said Laura. "Pa, when are we going to see a papoose?" "Goodness," Ma exclaimed. "What do you want to see an Indian baby for? Put on your sunbonnet now and forget such nonsense." Laura's sunbonnet hung down her back. She pulled it up by the strings, and its sides came past her cheeks. When her sunbonnet was on, she could only see what was in front of her, and that was why she was always pushing it back and letting it hang by strings tied around her throat. She put her sunbonnet on when Ma told her to, but she did not forget the papoose. This was Indian country, and she didn't know why she didn't see Indians. She knew she would see them sometime, though. Pa said so, but she was getting tired of waiting. Pa had taken the canvas wagon top off the house, and now he was ready to put the roof on. For days and days he had been hauling logs from the creek bottoms and splitting them into thin, long slabs. Pile of slabs lay all around the house, and slabs stood against it. "Come out of the house, Caroline," he said. "I don't want to risk anything falling on you or Carrie." "Wait, Charles, till I put away the china shepherdess," Ma answered. In a minute she came out with a quilt and her mending and baby Carrie. She spread the quilt on the shady grass by the stable and sat there to do her mending and watch Carrie play. Pa reached down and pulled up a slab. He laid it across the ends of the sapling rafters. Its edge stuck out beyond the wall. Then Pa put some nails in his mouth and took his hammer out of his belt, and he began to nail the slab to the rafters. Mr. Edwards had lent him the nails. They had met in the woods, where they were both chopping down trees, and Mr. Edwards had insisted that Pa borrow nails for the roof. "That's what I call a good neighbor," Pa said when he told Ma about it. "Yes," said Ma, "but I don't like to be beholden, not even to the best of neighbors." "Nor I," Pa replied. "I've never been beholden to any man yet, and I never will be. But neighborliness is another matter, and I'll pay him back every nail as soon as I can make the trip to Independence." Now Pa carefully took the nails one by one from his mouth, and with ringing blows of the hammer, he drove them into the slab. It was much quicker than drilling holes and whittling pegs and driving them into the holes. But every now and then, a nail sprang away from the tough oak when the hammer hit it, and if Pa was not holding it firm, it went sailing through the air. Then Mary and Laura watched it fall, and they searched in the grass till they found it. Sometimes it was bent. Then Pa carefully pounded it straight again. It would never do to lose or waste a nail. When Pa had nailed down 2 slabs, he got up on them. He laid and nailed more slabs, all the way to the top of the rafters. The edge of each slab lapped over the edge of the slab below it. Then he began again on the other side of the house, and he laid the roof all the way up from that side. A little crack was left between the highest slabs, so Pa made a little trough of 2 slabs, and he nailed this trough firmly upside down over the crack. The roof was done. The house was darker than it had been because no light came through the slabs. There was not one single crack that would let rain come in. "You've done a splendid job, Charles," Ma said, "and I'm thankful to have a good roof over my head." "You shall have furniture too, as fine as I can make it," Pa replied. "I'll make a bedstead as soon as the floor is laid." He began again to haul logs. Day after day he hauled logs. He did not even stop hauling logs to go hunting. He took his gun on the wagon and brought back at night whatever meat he had shot from the wagon seat. When he had hauled enough logs to make the floor, he began to split them. He split each log straight down the middle. Laura liked to sit on the woodpile and watch him. First, with a mighty blow of his axe, he split the butt of the log. Into the crack he slipped the thin edge of an iron wedge. Then he wrenched the axe out of the log, and he drove the wedge deeper into the crack. The rough wood split a little farther. All the way up the log, Pa fought that tough oak. He struck with his axe into the crack. He drove blocks of wood into it and moved the iron edge higher. Little by little, he followed the crack up the log. He swung the axe high and brought it down with a great swing and a grunt from his chest. Ugh! It always struck exactly where Pa wanted it to. At last, with a tearing, cracking sound, the whole log split. Its 2 halves lay on the ground, showing the tree's pale insides and the darker streak up its middle. Then Pa wiped the sweat from his forehead. He took a fresh grip on the axe, and he tackled another log. One day, the last log was split, and next morning, Pa began to lay the floor. He dragged the logs into the house and laid them one by one flat side up. With his spade, he scraped the ground underneath and fitted the round side of the log firmly down into it. With his axe, he trimmed away the edge of bark and cut the wood straight, so that each log fitted against the next with hardly a crack between them. Then he took the head of the axe in his hand, and with little, careful blows, he smoothed the wood. He squinted along the log to see that the surface was straight and true. He took off last little bits here and there. Finally, he ran his hand over the smoothness and nodded. "Not a splinter," he said. "That'll be all right for little bare feet to run over." He left that log fitted in its place and dragged in another. When he came to the fireplace, he used shorter logs. He left a space of bare earth for a hearth, so that when sparks or coals popped out of the fire, they would not burn the floor. One day, the floor was done. It was smooth and firm and hard. A good floor of solid oak that would last, Pa said, forever. "You can't beat a good punchin' floor," he said, and Ma said she was glad to be up off the dirt. She put the little China woman on the mantel shelf and spread a red checked cloth on the table. "There," she said. "Now we're living like civilized folks again." After that, Pa filled the cracks in the walls. He drove thin strips of wood into them and plastered them well with mud, filling every chink. "That's a good job," Ma said. "That chinking will keep out the wind, no matter how hard it blows." Pa stopped whistling to smile at her. He slapped the last bit of mud between the logs and smoothed it and set down the bucket. At last, the house was finished. "I wish we had glass for the windows," Pa said. "We don't need glass, Charles," said Ma. "Just the same, if I do well with my hunting and trapping this winter, I'm going to get some glass in Independence next spring," said Pa, "and hang the expense." "Glass windows would be nice if we can afford them," Ma said, "but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it." They were all happy that night. The fire on the hearth was pleasant, for on the high prairie even the summer nights were cool. The red checked cloth was on the table, the little china woman glimmered on the mantel shelf, and the new floor was golden in the flickering firelight. Outside, the night was large and full of stars. Pa sat for a long time in the doorway and played his fiddle and sang to Ma and Mary and Laura in the house and to the starry night outside. Chapter 11. Indians in the House. Early one morning, Pa took his gun and went hunting. He had meant to make the bedstead that day. He had brought in the slabs when Ma said she had no meat for dinner. So he stood the slabs against the wall and took down his gun. Jack wanted to go hunting too. His eyes begged Pa to take him, and whines came up from his chest and quivered in his throat till Laura almost cried with him. But Pa chained him to the stable. "No, Jack," Pa said. "You must stay here and guard the place." Then he said to Mary and Laura, "Don't let him loose, girls." Poor Jack lay down. It was a disgrace to be chained, and he felt it deeply. He turned his head from Pa and would not watch him going away with the gun on his shoulder. Pa went farther and farther away till the prairie swallowed him and he was gone. Laura tried to comfort Jack, but he would not be comforted. The more he thought about the chain, the worse he felt. Laura tried to cheer him up to frisk and play, but he only grew more sullen. Both Mary and Laura felt that they could not leave Jack while he was so unhappy. So all that morning they stayed by the stable. They stroked Jack's smooth head and scratched around his ears, and told him how sorry they were that he must be chained. He lapped their hands a little bit, but he was very sad and angry. His head was on Laura's knee and she was talking to him, when suddenly he stood up and growled a fierce, deep growl. The hair on his neck stood straight up and his eyes glared red. Laura was frightened. Jack had never growled at her before. Then she looked over her shoulder where Jack was looking, and she saw two naked wild men coming, one behind the other on the Indian trail. "Mary, look!" she cried. Mary looked and saw them too. They were tall, thin, fierce-looking men. Their skin was brownish red. Their heads seemed to go up to a peak, and the peak was a tuft of hair that stood straight up and ended in feathers. Their eyes were black and still and glittering like snakes' eyes. They came closer and closer. Then they went out of sight and on the other side of the house. Laura's head turned, and so did Mary's, and they looked at the place where those terrible men would appear when they came past the house. "Indians," Mary whispered. Laura was shivery. There was a strange feeling in her middle, and the bones in her legs felt weak. She wanted to sit down, but she stood and looked and waited for those Indians to come out from beyond the house. The Indians did not do that. All this time, Jack had been growling. Now he stopped growling and was lunging against the chain. His eyes were red and his lips curled back, and all the hair on his back was bristling. He bounded and bounded clear off the ground, trying to get loose from the chain. Laura was glad that the chain kept him right there with her. "Jack's here," she whispered to Mary. "Jack won't let them hurt us. We'll be safe if we stay close to Jack." "They're in the house," Mary whispered. "They're in the house with Ma and Carrie." Then Laura began to shake all over. She knew she must do something. She did not know what those Indians were doing to Ma and baby Carrie. There was no sound at all from the house. "Oh, what are they doing to Ma?" she screamed in a whisper. "Oh, I don't know," Mary whispered. "I'm going to let Jack loose," Laura whispered hoarsely. "Jack will kill them." "Pa said not to," Mary answered. They were too scared to speak out loud. They put their heads together and watched the house and whispered. "He didn't know Indians would come," Laura said. "He said not to let Jack loose," Mary was almost crying. Laura thought of little baby Carrie and Ma shut in the house with those Indians. She said, "I'm going in to help Ma." She ran 2 steps and walked a step, and then she turned and flew back to Jack. She clutched him wildly and hung on to his strong, panting neck. Jack wouldn't let anything hurt her. "We mustn't leave Ma in there alone," Mary whispered. She stood still and trembled. Mary never could move when she was frightened. Laura hid her face against Jack and held on to him tightly. Then she made her arms let go. Her hands balled into fists and her eyes shut tight, and she ran toward the house as fast as she could run. She stumbled and fell down, and her eyes popped open. She was up again and running before she could think. Mary was close behind her. They came to the door. It was open, and they slipped into the house without a sound. The naked wild men stood by the fireplace. Ma was bending over the fire cooking something. Carrie clung to Ma's skirts with both hands, and her head was hidden in the folds. Laura ran toward Ma, but just as she reached the hearth, she smelled a horribly bad smell, and she looked up at the Indians. Quick as a flash, she ducked behind the long, narrow slab that leaned against the wall. The slab was just wide enough to cover both her eyes. If she held her head perfectly still and pressed her nose against the slab, she couldn't see the Indians, and she felt safer. But she couldn't help moving her head just a little, so that one eye peeped out and she could see the wild men. First, she saw their leather moccasins, then their stringy, bare, red-brown legs all the way up. Around their waists, each of the Indians wore a leather thong, and the furry skin of a small animal hung down in front. The fur was striped black and white, and now Laura knew what made that smell. The skins were fresh skunk skins. A knife like Pa's hunting knife and a hatchet like Pa's hatchet were stuck into each skunk skin. The Indians' ribs made little ridges up their bare sides. Their arms were folded on their chests. At last, Laura looked again at their faces, and she dodged quickly behind the slab. Their faces were bold and fierce and terrible. Their black eyes glittered. High on their foreheads and above their ears where hair grows, these wild men had no hair. But on top of their heads, a tuft of hair stood straight up. It was wound around with string, and feathers were stuck in it. When Laura peeked out from behind the slab again, both Indians were looking straight at her. Her heart jumped into her throat and choked her with its pounding. 2 black eyes glittered down into her eyes. The Indian did not move. Not one muscle of his face moved. Only his eyes shone and sparkled at her. Laura didn't move either. She didn't even breathe. The Indian made 2 short, harsh sounds in his throat. The other Indian made one sound, like "ha." Laura hid her eyes behind the slab again. She heard Ma take the cover off the bake oven. She heard the Indians squat down on the hearth. After a while, she heard them eating. Laura peeked and hid and peeked again, while the Indians ate the cornbread that Ma had baked. They ate every morsel of it, and even picked up the crumbs from the hearth. Ma stood and watched them and stroked baby Carrie's head. Mary stood close behind Ma and held on to her sleeve. Faintly, Laura heard Jack's chain rattling. Jack was still trying to get loose. When every crumb of the cornbread was gone, the Indians rose up. The skunk smell was stronger when they moved. One of them made harsh sounds in his throat again. Ma looked at him with big eyes. She did not say anything. The Indian turned around. The other Indian turned too, and they walked across the floor and out through the door. Their feet made no sound at all. Ma sighed a long, long sigh. She hugged Laura tight in one arm and Mary tight in the other, and through the window they watched those Indians going away, one behind the other, on the dim trail toward the west. Then Ma sat down on the bed and hugged Laura and Mary tighter and trembled. She looked sick. "Do you feel sick, Ma?" Mary asked her. "No," said Ma. "I'm just thankful they're gone." Laura wrinkled her nose and said, "They smell awful." "That was the skunk skins they wore," Ma said. Then they told her how they had left Jack and had come into the house because they were afraid the Indians would hurt her and baby Carrie. Ma said they were brave little girls. "Now we must get dinner," she said. "Pa will be here soon, and we must have dinner ready for him. Mary, bring me some wood. Laura, you may set the table." Ma rolled up her sleeves and washed her hands and mixed cornbread, while Mary brought the wood and Laura set the table. She set a tin plate and knife and fork and cup for Pa, and the same for Ma, with Carrie's little tin cup beside Ma's. And she set tin plates and knives and forks for her and Mary, but only their one cup between the plates. Ma made the cornmeal and water into 2 thin loaves, each shaped in a half circle. She laid the loaves with their straight sides together in the bake oven, and she pressed her hand flat on top of each loaf. Pa always said he did not ask any other sweetening when Ma put the prints of her hands on the loaves. Laura had hardly set the table when Pa was there. He left a big rabbit and 2 prairie hens outside the door and stepped in and laid his gun on its pegs. Laura and Mary ran and clutched him, both talking at once. "What's all this? What's all this?" he said, rumpling their hair. "Indians? So you've seen Indians at last, have you, Laura? I noticed they have a camp in a little valley west of here. Did Indians come to the house, Caroline?" "Yes, Charles, 2 of them," Ma said. "I'm sorry, but they took all your tobacco, and they ate a lot of cornbread. They pointed to the cornmeal and made signs for me to cook some. I was afraid not to. Oh, Charles, I was afraid." "You did the right thing," Pa told her. "We don't want to make enemies of any Indians." Then he said, "Whew, what a smell." "They wore fresh skunk skins," said Ma, "and that was all they wore." "Must have been thick while they were here," Pa said. "It was, Charles. We were short of cornmeal, too. Oh well, we have enough to hold out a while yet, and our meat is running all over the country. Don't worry, Caroline. But they took all your tobacco." "Never mind," Pa said. "I'll get along without tobacco till I make that trip to Independence. The main thing is to be on good terms with the Indians. We don't want to wake up some night with a band of screeching He stopped Laura dreadfully wanted to know what he had been going to say, but Ma's lips were pressed together, and she shook a little shake of her head at Pa. "Come on, Mary and Laura," Pa said. "We'll skin that rabbit and dress the prairie hens while the cornbread bakes. Hurry, I'm hungry as a wolf." They sat on the woodpile in the wind and sunshine and watched Pa work with his hunting knife. But Laura could not forget the Indians. She said to Pa that if they had turned Jack loose, he would have eaten those Indians right up. Pa laid down the knife. "Did you girls even think of turning Jack loose?" he asked in a dreadful voice. Laura's head bowed down and she whispered, "Yes, Pa." "After I told you not to?" Pa said in a more dreadful voice. Laura couldn't speak, but Mary choked, "Yes, Pa." For a moment Pa was silent. He sighed a long sigh, like Ma's sigh after the Indians went away. After this, he said in a terrible voice, "You girls remember always to do as you're told. Don't you even think of disobeying me, do you hear?" "Yes, Pa," Laura and Mary whispered. "Do you know what would have happened if you had turned Jack loose?" Pa asked. "No, Pa," they whispered. "He would have bitten those Indians," said Pa. "Then there would have been trouble, bad trouble. Do you understand?" "Yes, Pa," they said, but they did not understand. "Would they have killed Jack?" Laura asked. "Yes, and that's not all. You girls remember this. You do as you're told, no matter what happens." "Yes, Pa," Laura said, and Mary said, "Yes, Pa." They were glad they had not turned Jack loose. "Do as you're told," said Pa, "and no harm will come to you." Chapter 12. Fresh Water to Drink. Pa had made the bedstead. He had smoothed the oak slabs till there was not a splinter on them. Then he pegged them firmly together. 4 slabs made a box to hold the straw tick. Across the bottom of it, Pa stretched a rope zigzagged from side to side and pulled tight. One end of the bedstead Pa pegged solidly to the wall in a corner of the house. Only one corner of the bed was not against a wall. At this corner, Pa set up a tall slab. He pegged it to the bedstead. As high up as he could reach, he pegged 2 strips of oak to the walls and to the tall slab. Then he climbed up on them and pegged the top of the tall slab solidly to a rafter. And on the strips of oak, he laid a shelf above the bed. "There you are, Caroline," he said. "I can't wait to see it made up," said Ma. "Help me bring in the straw tick." She had filled the straw tick that morning. There was no straw on the high prairie, so she had filled it with dry, clean, dead grass. It was hot from the sunshine, and it had a grassy, sweet smell. Pa helped her bring it into the house and lay it in the bedstead. She tucked the sheets in and spread her prettiest patchwork quilt over them. At the head of the bed, she set up the goose feather pillows and spread the pillow shams against them. On each white pillow sham, 2 little birds were outlined with red thread. Then Ma and Pa and Laura and Mary stood and looked at the bed. It was a very nice bed. The zigzag rope was softer than the floor to sleep on. The straw tick was plump with the sweet-smelling grass. The quilt lay smooth, and the pretty pillow shams stood up crisply. The shelf was a good place to store things. The whole house had quite an air with such a bed in it. That night when Ma went to bed, she settled into the crackling straw tick and said to Pa, "I declare I'm so comfortable it's almost sinful." Mary and Laura still slept on the floor, but Pa would make a little bed for them as soon as he could, He had made the big bed, and he had made a stout cupboard and padlocked it, so the Indians could not take all the cornmeal if they came again. Now he had only to dig a well, and then he would make that trip to town. He must dig the well first, so that Ma could have water while he was gone. Next morning, he marked a large circle in the grass near the corner of the house. With his spade, he cut the sod inside the circle and lifted it up in large pieces. Then he began to shovel out the earth, digging himself deeper and deeper down. Mary and Laura must not go near the well while Pa was digging. Even when they couldn't see his head anymore, shovelfuls of earth came flying up. At last, the spade flew up and fell in the grass. Then Pa jumped. His hands caught hold of the sod. Then one elbow gripped it, and then the other elbow, and with a heave, Pa came rolling out. "I can't throw the dirt out from any deeper," he said. He had to have help now, so he took his gun and rode away on Patty. When he came back, he brought a plump rabbit, and he had traded work with Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott would help him dig this well, and then he would help dig Mr. Scott's well. Ma and Laura and Mary had not seen Mr. and Mrs. Scott. Their house was hidden somewhere in a little valley on the prairie. Laura had seen the smoke rising from it, and that was all. At sunup next morning, Mr. Scott came. He was short and stout. His hair was bleached by the sun, and his skin was bright red and scaly. He did not tan, he peeled. "It's this blasted sun and wind," he said. "Beg your pardon, ma'am, but it's enough to make a saint use strong language. I might as well be a snake, the way I keep on shedding my skin in this country." Laura liked him. Every morning, as soon as the dishes were washed and the beds made, she ran out to watch Mr. Scott and Pa work at the well. The sunshine was blistering, even the winds were hot, and the prairie grasses were turning yellow. Mary preferred to stay in the house and sew on her patchwork quilt, but Laura liked the fierce light and the sun and the wind, and she couldn't stay away from the well, but she was not allowed to go near its edge. Pa and Mr. Scott had made a stout windlass. It stood over the well, and 2 buckets hung from it on the ends of a rope. When the windlass was turned, 1 bucket went down into the well, and the other bucket came up. In the morning, Mr. Scott slid down the rope and dug. He filled the buckets with earth, almost as fast as Pa could haul them up and empty them. After dinner, Pa slid down the rope into the well, and Mr. Scott hauled up the buckets. Every morning before Pa would let Mr. Scott go down the rope, he set a candle in a bucket and lighted it and lowered it to the bottom. Once Laura peeped over the edge, and she saw the candle brightly burning far down in the dark hole in the ground. Then Pa would say, "Seems to be all right," and he would pull up the bucket and blow out the candle. "That's all foolishness, Ingalls," Mr. Scott said. "The well was all right yesterday." "You can't ever tell," Pa replied. "Better be safe than sorry." Laura did not know what danger Pa was looking for by the candlelight. She did not ask, because Pa and Mr. Scott were busy. She meant to ask later, but she forgot. One morning, Mr. Scott came while Pa was eating breakfast. They heard him shout, "Hi, Ingalls, it's sunup, let's go." Pa drank his coffee and went out. The windlass began to creak and Pa began to whistle. Laura and Mary were washing the dishes, and Ma was making the big bed when Pa's whistling stopped. They heard him say, "Scott! Scott!" Then he called, "Caroline, come quick." Ma ran out of the house. Laura ran after her. "Scott's fainted or something down there," Pa said. "I've got to go down after him." Did you send down the candle? Ma asked. No, I thought he had. I had asked him if it was all right, and he said it was. Pa cut the empty bucket off the rope and tied the rope firmly to the windlass. Charles, you can't. You mustn't, Ma said. Caroline, I've got to. You can't. Oh, Charles, no. I'll make it all right. I won't breathe till I get out. We can't let him die down there. Ma said fiercely, Laura, keep back. So Laura kept back. She stood against the house and shivered. No, no, Charles, I can't let you, Ma said. Get on Patty and go for help. There isn't time. Charles, if you keel over down there and I can't pull you up. Caroline, I've got to, Pa said. He swung into the well. His head slid out of sight down the rope. Ma crouched and shaded her eyes, staring down into the well. All over the prairie, meadowlarks were rising, singing, flying straight up into the sky. The wind was blowing warmer, but Laura was cold. Suddenly, Ma jumped up and seized the handle of the windlass. She tugged at it with all her might. The rope strained and the windlass creaked. Laura thought that Pa had keeled over, down in the dark bottom of the well, and Ma couldn't pull him up. But the windlass turned a little, and then a little more. Pa's hand came up, holding to the rope. His other hand reached above it and took hold of the rope. Then Pa's head came up. His arm held onto the windlass. Then somehow he got to the ground and sat there. The windlass whirled around, and there was a thud deep down in the well. Pa struggled to get up, and Ma said, Sit still, Charles. Laura, get some water, quick. Laura ran. She came hurrying back, lugging the pail of water. Pa and Ma were both turning the windlass. The rope slowly wound itself up, and the bucket came out of the well, and tied to the bucket and the rope was Mr. Scott. His arms and his legs and his head hung and wobbled. His mouth was partly opened and his eyes half shut. Pa tugged him onto the grass. Pa rolled him over and he flopped where he was rolled. Pa felt his wrist and listened at his chest, and then Pa lay down beside him. He's breathing, Pa said. He'll be all right in the air. I'm all right, Caroline. I'm plumb tuckered out is all. Well, Ma scolded, I should think you would be. Of all the senseless performances. My goodness gracious, scaring a body to death, all for want of a little reasonable care. My goodness, She covered her face with her apron and burst out crying. That was a terrible day. I don't want a well, Ma sobbed. It isn't worth it. I won't have you running such risks. Mr. Scott had breathed a kind of gas that stays deep in the ground. It stays at the bottom of wells because it is heavier than the air. It cannot be seen or smelled, but no one can breathe it very long and live. Pa had gone down into that gas to tie Mr. Scott to the rope so that he could be pulled up out of the gas. When Mr. Scott was able, he went home. Before he went, he said to Pa, You were right about that candle business, Ingalls. I thought it was all foolishness, and I would not bother with it, but I found out my mistake. Well, said Pa, where a light can't live, I know I can't, and I like to be safe when I can be, but all is well that ends well. Pa rested a while. He had breathed a little of the gas, and he felt like resting. But that afternoon, he raveled a thread from a tow sack, and he took a little powder from his powder horn. He tied the powder in a piece of cloth with one end of the tow string in the powder. Come along, Laura, he said, and I'll show you something. They went to the well. Pa lighted the end of the string and waited till the spark was crawling quickly along it. Then he dropped the little bundle into the well. In a minute, they heard a muffled bang, and a puff of smoke came out of the well. "That will bring the gas," Pa said. When the smoke was all gone, he let Laura light the candle and stand beside him while he let it down. All the way down in the dark hole, the little candle kept on burning like a star. So next day, Pa and Mr. Scott went on digging the well, but they always sent the candle down every morning. There began to be a little water in the well, but it was not enough. The buckets came up full of mud, and Pa and Mr. Scott worked every day in deeper mud. In the mornings, when the candle went out, it lighted oozing wet walls, and candlelight sparkled in rings over the water when the bucket struck bottom. Pa stood knee-deep in water and bailed out bucketfuls before he could begin digging in the mud. One day, when he was digging, a loud shout came echoing up. Ma ran out of the house, and Laura ran to the well. "Pull, Scott, pull!" Pa yelled. A swishing, gurgling sound echoed down there. Mr. Scott turned the windlass as fast as he could, and Pa came up climbing hand over hand up the rope. "I'm blamed if that's not quicksand," Pa gasped as he stepped onto the ground, muddy and dripping. "I was pushing down hard on the spade, when all of a sudden it went down the whole length of the handle, and water came pouring up all around me." "A good 6 feet of this rope's wet," Mr. Scott said, winding it up. "The bucket was full of water. You showed sense in getting out of that hand over hand, Ingalls. That water came up faster than I could pull you up." Then Mr. Scott slapped his thigh and shouted, "I'm blasted if you didn't bring up the spade." Sure enough, Pa had saved his spade. In a little while, the well was almost full of water. A circle of blue sky lay not far down in the ground, and when Laura looked at it, a little girl's head looked up at her. When she waved her hand, a hand on the water's surface waved too. The water was clear and cold and good. Laura thought she had never tasted anything so good as those long, cold drinks of water. Pa hauled no more stale, warm water from the creek. He built a solid platform over the well and a heavy cover for the hole that let the water bucket through. Laura must never touch that cover, but whenever she or Mary was thirsty, Ma lifted the cover and drew a dripping bucket of cold, fresh water from the well. Chapter 13, Texas Longhorns. One evening, Laura and Pa were sitting on the doorstep. The moon shone over the dark prairie, the winds were still, and softly Pa played his fiddle. He let a last note quiver far, far away until it dissolved in the moonlight. Everything was so beautiful that Laura wanted it to stay so forever. But Pa said it was time for little girls to go to bed. Then Laura heard a strange, low, distant sound. "What's that?" she said. Pa listened. "Cattle, by George," he said. "Must be the cattle herds going north to Fort Dodge." After she was undressed, Laura stood in her nightgown at the window. The air was very still, not a grass blade rustled, and far away and faint she could hear that sound. It was almost a rumble and almost a song. "Is that singing, Pa?" she asked. "Yes," Pa said. "The cowboys are singing the cattle to sleep. Now hop into bed, you little scalawag." Laura thought of cattle lying on the dark ground in the moonlight, and of cowboys softly singing lullabies. Next morning, when she ran out of the house, 2 strange men were sitting on horses by the stable. They were talking to Pa. They were as red-brown as Indians, but their eyes were narrow slits between squinting eyelids. They wore flaps of leather over their legs, and spurs and wide-brimmed hats. Handkerchiefs were knotted around their necks, and pistols were on their hips. They said "so long" to Pa and "hi yip" to their horses, and they galloped away. "Here's a piece of luck," Pa said to Ma. "Those men were cowboys. They wanted Pa to help them keep the cattle out of the ravines among the bluffs of the creek bottoms. Pa would not charge them any money, but he told them he would take a piece of beef." "How would you like a good piece of beef?" Pa asked. "Oh, Charles," said Ma, and her eyes shone. Pa tied his biggest handkerchief round his neck. He showed Laura how he could pull it up over his mouth and nose to keep the dust out. Then he rode Patty west along the Indian trail till Laura and Mary couldn't see him any more. All day the hot sun blazed and the hot winds blew, and the sound of the cattle herds came nearer. It was a faint, mournful sound of cattle lowing. At noon, dust was blowing along the horizon. Ma said that so many cattle trampled the grasses flat and stirred up dust from the prairie. Pa came riding home at sunset, covered with dust. There was dust in his beard and in his hair and on the rims of his eyelids, and dust fell off his clothes. He did not bring any beef because the cattle were not across the creek yet. The cattle went very slowly, eating grass as they went. They had to eat enough grass to be fat when they came to the cities where people ate them. Pa did not talk much that night, and he didn't play the fiddle. He went to bed soon after supper. The herds were so near now that Laura could hear them plainly. The mournful lowing sounded over the prairie till the night was dark. Then the cattle were quieter, and the cowboys began to sing. Their songs were not like lullabies. They were high, lonely, wailing songs, almost like the howling of wolves. Laura lay awake, listening to the lonely songs wandering in the night. Farther away, real wolves howled. Sometimes the cattle lowed, but the cowboy's song went on, rising and falling and wailing away under the moon. When everyone else was asleep, Laura stole softly to the window, and she saw 3 fires gleaming like red eyes from the dark edge of the land. Overhead, the sky was big and still and full of moonlight. The lonely song seemed to be crying for the moon. They made Laura's throat ache. All next day, Laura and Mary watched the west. They could hear the faraway bawling of the cattle. They could see dust blowing. Sometimes they thinly heard a shrill yell. Suddenly, a dozen longhorned cattle burst out of the prairie not far from the stable. They had come up out of a draw going down to the creek bottoms. Their tails stood up, and their fierce horns tossed, and their feet pounded the ground. A cowboy on a spotted Mustang galloped madly to get in front of them. He waved his big hat and yelled sharp, high yells. The cattle wheeled, clashing their long horns together. With lifted tails, they galloped lumbering away, and behind them, the Mustang ran and whirled and ran, herding them together. They all went over a rise of ground and down out of sight. Laura ran back and forth, waving her sunbonnet and yelling, till Ma told her to stop. It was not ladylike to yell like that. Laura wished she could be a cowboy. Late that afternoon, 3 riders came out of the west, driving one lone cow. One of the riders was Pa. on Patty. Slowly they came nearer, and Laura saw that with the cow was a little spotted calf. The cow came lunging and plunging. 2 cowboys rode well apart in front of her. 2 ropes around her long horns were fastened to the cowboys' saddles. When the cow lunged with her horns toward either cowboy, the other cowboy's pony braced its feet and held her. The cow bawled, and the little calf bleated thinner bawls. Ma watched from the window, while Mary and Laura stood against the house and stared. The cowboys held the cow with their ropes while Pa tied her to the stable. Then they said goodbye to him and rode away. Ma could not believe that Pa had actually brought home a cow, but it really was their own cow. The calf was too small to travel, Pa said, and the cow would be too thin to sell, so the cowboys had given them to Pa. They had given him the beef, too. A big chunk was tied to his saddle horn. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura and even baby Carrie laughed for joy. Pa always laughed out loud, and his laugh was like great bells ringing. When Ma was pleased, she smiled a gentle smile that made Laura feel warm all over. But now she was laughing because they had a cow. "Give me a bucket, Caroline," said Pa. He was going to milk the cow right away. He took the bucket, he pushed back his hat, and he squatted by the cow to milk her. And that cow hunched herself and kicked Pa flat on his back. Pa jumped. His face was blazing red, and his eyes snapped blue sparks. "Now, by the great horn spoon, I'll milk her," he said. He got his axe, and he sharpened 2 stout slabs of oak. He pushed the cow against the stable, and he drove those slabs deep into the ground beside her. The cow bawled, and the little calf squalled. Pa tied poles firmly to the posts and stuck their ends into the cracks of the stable to make a fence. Now the cow could not move forward or backward or sidewise, but the little calf could nudge its way between its mother and the stable, so the baby calf felt safe and stopped bawling. It stood on that side of the cow and drank its supper, and Pa put his hand through the fence and milked from the other side. He got a tin cup almost full of milk. "We'll try again in the morning," he said. "The poor thing's as wild as a deer, but we'll gentle her." The dark was coming on. Nighthawks were chasing insects in the dark air. Bullfrogs were croaking in the creek bottoms. A bird called, "Whip, whip, whip." "Hoo, hoo," said an owl. Far away the wolves howled, and Jack was growling. "The wolves are following the herds," Pa said. "Tomorrow I'll build a strong, high yard for the cow that wolves can't get into." So they all went into the house with the beef. Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura all agreed to give the milk to baby Carrie. They watched her drink it. The tin cup hid her face, but Laura could see the gulps of milk going down her throat. Gulp by gulp, she swallowed all that good milk. Then she licked the foam from her lip with her red tongue and laughed. It seemed a long time before the cornbread and the sizzling beefsteaks were done, but nothing had ever tasted so good as that tough, juicy beef, and everyone was happy because now there would be milk to drink and perhaps even butter for the cornbread. The lowing of the cattle herds was far away again, and the songs of the cowboys were almost too faint to be heard. All those cattle were on the other side of the creek bottoms now in Kansas. Tomorrow they would slowly go farther on their long way northward to the Fort Dodge where the soldiers were. Chapter 14, Indian Camp. Day after day was hotter than the day before. The wind was hot, as if it came out of an oven, Ma said. The grass was turning yellow. The whole world was rippling green and gold under the blazing sky. At noon, the wind died. No birds sang. Everything was so still that Laura could hear the squirrels chattering in the trees down by the creek. Suddenly, black crows flew overhead, cawing their rough, sharp caws. Then everything was still again. Ma said that this was midsummer. Pa wondered where the Indians had gone. He said they had left their little camp on the prairie, and one day he asked Laura and Mary if they would like to see that camp. Laura jumped up and down and clapped her hands, but Ma objected. "It is so far, Charles," she said, "and in this heat." Pa's blue eyes twinkled. "This heat doesn't hurt the Indians, and it won't hurt us," he said. "Come on, girls." "Please, can Jack come too?" Laura begged. Pa had taken his gun, but he looked at Laura and he looked at Jack. Then he looked at Ma, and he put the gun up on its pegs again. "All right, Laura," he said. "I'll take Jack, Caroline, and leave you the gun." Jack jumped around them, wagging his stump of a tail. As soon as he saw which way they were going, he set off, trotting ahead. Pa came next, and behind him came Mary and then Laura. Mary kept her sunbonnet on, but Laura let hers dangle down her back. The ground was hot under their bare feet. The sunshine pierced through their faded dresses and tingled on their arms and backs. The air was really as hot as the air in an oven, and it smelled faintly like baking bread. Pa said the smell came from all the grass seeds parching in the heat. They went farther and farther into the vast prairie. Laura felt smaller and smaller. Even Pa did not seem as big as he really was. At last, they went down into the little hollow where the Indians had camped. Jack started up a big rabbit. When it bounded out of the grass, Laura jumped. Pa said, "Let him go, Jack. We have meat enough." So Jack sat down and watched the big rabbit go bounding away down the hollow. Laura and Mary looked around them. They stayed close to Pa. Low bushes grew on the sides of the hollow. Buckbrush with sprays of berries faintly pink, and sumac holding up green cones but showing here and there a bright red leaf. The goldenrod's blooms were turning gray, and the ox-eyed daisy's yellow petals hung down from the crown centers. All this was hidden in the secret little hollow. From the house, Laura had seen nothing but grasses, and now from this hollow she could not see the house. The prairie seemed to be level, but it was not level. Laura asked Pa if there were lots of hollows in the prairie like this one. He said there were. "Are Indians in them?" she almost whispered. He said he didn't know. There might be. She held tight to his hand, and Mary held to his other hand, and they looked at the Indians' camp. There were ashes where Indian campfires had been. There were holes in the ground where tent poles had been driven. Bones were scattered where Indian dogs had gnawed them. All along the sides of the hollow, Indian ponies had bitten the grasses short. Tracks of big moccasins and smaller moccasins were everywhere, and tracks of little bare toes. And over these tracks were tracks of rabbits and tracks of birds and wolves' tracks. Pa read the tracks for Mary and Laura. He showed them tracks of 2 middle-sized moccasins by the edge of a campfire ashes. An Indian woman had squatted there. She wore a leather skirt with fringes. The tiny marks of the fringe were in the dust. The track of her toes inside the moccasins was deeper than the track of her heels because she had leaned forward to stir something cooking in a pot on the fire. Then Pa picked up a smoke-blackened forked stick, and he said that the pot had hung from a stick laid across the top of 2 upright forked sticks. He showed Mary and Laura the holes where the forked sticks had been driven into the ground. Then he told them to look at the bones around the campfire and tell him what had cooked in that pot. They looked and they said, "Rabbit." That was right. The bones were rabbit bones. Suddenly, Laura shouted, "Look! Look!" Something bright blue glittered in the dust. She picked it up, and it was a beautiful blue bead. Laura shouted with joy. Then Mary saw a red bead, and Laura saw a green one, and they forgot everything but beads. Pa helped them look. They found white beads and brown beads, and more red and blue beads. All that afternoon they hunted for beads in the dust of the Indian camp. Now and then Pa walked up the edge of the hollow and looked toward home. Then he came back and helped to hunt for more beads. They looked all the ground over carefully. When they couldn't find any more, it was almost sunset. Laura had a handful of beads, and so did Mary. Pa tied them carefully in his handkerchief, Laura's beads in one corner and Mary's in another corner. He put the handkerchief in his pocket, and they started home. The sun was low behind their backs when they came out of the hollow. Home was small and very far away, and Pa did not have his gun. Pa walked so swiftly that Laura could hardly keep up. She trotted as fast as she could, but the sun sank faster. Home seemed farther and farther away. The prairie seemed larger, and a wind ran over it, whispering something frightening. All the grasses shook as if they were scared. Then Pa turned around, and his blue eyes twinkled at Laura. He said, "Getting tired, little half-pint? It's a long way for little legs." He picked her up, big girl that she was, and he settled her safe against his shoulder. He took Mary by the hand, and so they all came home together. Supper was cooking on the fire. Ma was setting the table, and baby Carrie played with little pieces of wood on the floor. Pa tossed the handkerchief to Ma. "I'm later than I meant, Caroline," he said, "but look what the girls found." He took the milk bucket and went quickly to bring Pet and Patty from the picket lines and to milk the cow. Ma untied the handkerchief and exclaimed at what she found. The beads were even prettier than they had been in the Indian camp. Laura stirred the beads with her finger and watched them sparkle and shine. "These are mine," she said. Then Mary said, "Carrie can have mine." Ma waited to hear what Laura would say. Laura didn't want to say anything. She wanted to keep those pretty beads. Her chest felt all hot inside, and she wished with all her might that Mary wouldn't always be such a good little girl. But she couldn't let Mary be better than she was. So she said slowly, "Carrie can have mine too." "That's my unselfish good little girl," said Ma. She poured Mary's beads into Mary's hands and Laura's into Laura's hands, and she said she would give them a thread to string them on. The beads would make a pretty necklace for Carrie to wear around her neck. Ma and Laura sat side by side on their bed, and they strung those pretty beads on the thread that Ma gave them. Each wet her end of the thread in her mouth and twisted it tightly. Then Mary put her end of the thread through the small hole in each of the beads, and Laura put her end through her beads one by one. They didn't say anything. Perhaps Mary felt sweet and good inside, but Laura didn't. When she looked at Mary, she wanted to slap her, so she dared not look at Mary again. The beads made a beautiful string. Carrie clapped her hands and laughed when she saw it. Then Ma tied it around Carrie's little neck, and it glittered there. Laura felt a little better. After all, her beads were not enough beads to make a whole string, and neither were Mary's. But together they made a whole string of beads for Carrie. When Carrie felt the beads on her neck, she grabbed at them. She was so little that she did not know any better than to break the string. So Ma untied it, and she put the beads away until Carrie should be old enough to wear them. And often after that, Laura thought of those pretty beads, and she was still naughty enough to want her beads for herself. But it had been a wonderful day. She could always think about that long walk across the prairie and about all they had seen in the Indian camp. Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.